All right, so I'm glad some people showed up in person or on Zoom because what I normally like to do during this class is have everybody share their experience of their abstinence project with one another. And but the first thing I'd like to do is talk about the rest of the semester and just so you kind of know what the timeline is, uh, and you feel comfortable with that. So let me just pull this up. Okay, so when we're thinking about this semester, um, it's a weird timeline because technically it says 7 weeks. Um, but it occurs on a Thursday. So think about it this way. Um, we're uh, the last week is the last class is really the seventh class. So there's no week 7. It's only class 7. Um, because your final papers due class 7. That's why, because the grades are due that weekend. So technically, if it started on a Monday, we'd kind of have all week. So right now, I opened up, week 6. It's where you can put your abstinence project in the Dropbox if you haven't yet. Try to get that in. If you don't already have it in, it's technically due today, but try to get it in, by Saturday morning, because I'd like to grade the papers this weekend, because next weekend I'm going to have to grade your final paper. So I'd also like you to receive your grades for this paper, so you kind of know where you are with everything. With that being said, the other thing is, like I said, I am all about mastery learning. So I'm not going to take any points off if you get all, and if you missed a discussion board, get it done, and I'll read it and give you the points. Try not to wait till the last class because I'm going to have a lot of grading to do the very last weekend, but try to get them done throughout the week. And I'll also be working on discussion board post grading this week. So I'm hoping that you don't have a discussion board for the last week of class. I just said work on your papers. So you should be able to catch up on anything if you need to. I should be able to catch up on grading and finish the abstinence project. And then the only thing we'll have left is the final paper. So for uh, for week 6, I have a few different things. I have an article on gambling addiction. I have a thing for internet addiction, sex addiction, compulsive buying. I threw in a lot of, like I said, I got a lot of PowerPoints from a textbook I used to use. And I just threw in a bunch of different PowerPoint outlines on different subjects in case you were interested in them. Um, like the effects of drug addiction or drug use uh, on pregnancy, things like that. Um, the And then in week 7, the only thing that's there is the final Dropbox for the final paper. And we will meet next Thursday. And really the whole purpose for meeting next Thursday, which is our last class, is to share your papers with one another. I always think it's fun if you kind of talk about what you've learned for your paper with each other. I think we learn from each other. And I mean, why not share all that work with your classmates? I'm the only one who gets to read them. So, and we're going to wrap up. I'm going to let you ask me any questions if there's something you want to know. I'm going to look through all of the D2L things, see if there's anything important I missed that might be on the NCEs and cover that. I think we got most of the main things. And then that'll be it. That'll be the last class. And even though it says week 7, it's really class 7. And then I'll put the grades in over that weekend following next week's class. And it'll be a wrap for this summer semester. So any questions about the timeline, when things are due, anything like that? How about any questions about the final paper? On week 7 on D2L, I did put the instructions. My instructions on D2L are a lot easier than what you'll find in the syllabus. The syllabus is a generic syllabus they required me to use. I simplified the outline of this final paper. I lowered the number of pages. I put it into 3 different parts that are pretty straightforward. I think you'll find it easier to understand and easier to write. So with that being said, any questions about the final paper before we move on? Okay. So we're gonna share the abstinence last, because I do want to talk about a couple subjects. So when we think about gambling addiction, internet addiction, I put 2 articles on here. So it talks about internet addiction, sex addiction, and compulsive buying. I don't think those 3 things should be grouped together like most people do. A lot of times they'll group them together because they're kind of addictions of our age, of our time period. But I don't think they're all related in the same way. So we'll talk about that briefly. A lot of people group them together because those addictions became prominent during the same time period, but I think they are different. So we do have an entire course just on gambling addiction, and we have an expert at our university, John Masella, and I know him pretty well, and you can take that course as part of our addiction certificate. And let's see. So let's talk a little bit about the relationship between gambling addiction, both in real life and online. And then we'll talk about basically internet and social media addiction. And they are all related, okay? Because before the internet, if you think about it, when you go into a casino. So they didn't really, the closest thing they had to gambling was basically illegal. And you could bet on the numbers, you could, bet on whatever thing you wanted, but it was usually underground. And unless you actually went to a legal casino. So if you do go to a casino, the first thing you notice is all of the lights. And a lot of those lights come from what? You've probably played it before. Yeah, yeah, the one-armed bandit, the slot machines. All right. And so let's talk about the concepts that they use. So first, they want to draw you in a sensory manner. So the first thing you're attracted by is noises and lights. And those two things automatically draw our attention because, it's a very primitive thing. If we see a light, if we hear a noise, it automatically, involuntarily draws our attention to what's going on. Once it gets our attention, then we go from there. Before we even begin to play, you can no longer put real money. You can't gamble with real money. You have to gamble with chips. All the chips are the same size. They're just different colors with different numbers on them. So think about this. Somebody might have, $100 to gamble with, and they go in and they exchange that money for 10 $10 chips. So that each chip is what they're able to risk. So they're like, oh, I can lose $100. I'm going to gamble with $100. $100 is what I'm willing to risk. So every time they put a $10 chip down, internally, emotionally, they feel the tug of that risk. Okay. Somebody else might come in and they might have $100,000 to risk. But when they cash that in, they might still only get 10 chips. So they might get 10 $10,000 chips. When that person bets $10,000, because they have more to bet, the tug is about the same. The emotional risk is the same as somebody who could only risk $100. Because to the poorer person, $100 was a lot of money. It's a lot of money to me. But to a person who has a lot of money, maybe $10,000 is what they're willing to risk. So those two chips, whether it's $10 or $10,000, is the same risk that that person is willing to take. So when we think about it, that's why all the chips look the same. They're just different colors with different numbers. So it's different with real money. We have different size coins. We have paper money. A lot of the paper money looks the same, but so we put a different emotional value to real money than we do chips. Chips is almost like play money. It's not the same as, I would have a lot harder time putting down a $10 bill than I would a $10 chip. The other thing is, the easiest thing to risk is numbers on a computer screen. That doesn't seem like real money at all. So when we think about it, the first thing they do is change our perception of money. And they change it by making us cash in our real money, by only using chips, by changing it to just computerized numbers. So emotionally, it doesn't have the same value as real cash. Um, so that's the first change that we experience emotionally and cognitively. The second thing they do is that when people are stressed out, they experience anxiety or they get very tired or agitated. They might take shorter breaths. So one thing they usually did, I don't know if they still do it, but they would pump in oxygen, higher levels of oxygen into the casinos, and that would wake you up. And it would also relieve anxiety. So people would stay all night. What's the thing you get free if you know, start playing not the not the slot machines, but if you, huh?
Table games,
What's that?
table games. Like
Yeah, if you start playing table games, free drinks, absolutely. So alcohol's cheap. It's not cheap to buy, but it's a cheap giveaway. So, you know, we've already talked about alcohol, and one of the things it does is it lowers inhibitions. So if you're gambling, the inhibition that's going to get lowered is risk taking and risking money. So that chip might have had a certain risk value emotionally before you drank alcohol, but it will feel a lot lower once you drink alcohol. So let's talk about once you begin to play. So the electronic games have a very similar payoff to electronic games on your phone. So there are noises, there are numbers that spin around. You actively pull down an arm as if you're participating. Now they just hit a button. And if you win something, more sounds and lights. So think about the earliest Pavlovian experiments, okay, with the dogs. So what they would do, they would ring a bell and feed the dog. Then every time they rang the bell, the dog would salivate and want to eat. So if somebody gets used to bells ringing and sounds and lights going off when they win, they associate those sounds with winning money, with a payoff. The other thing it does is it connects our pleasure zone, that pleasure zones that create brain chemicals, the reward centers in our brain, with whatever we are playing. So, for instance, you've got lights, you've got sounds, you've got the participation, and you've got a financial payoff. And all of that begins to create connections because when we win, we get a little hit of dopamine or serotonin or a mixture of brain chemicals that reinforce all of the conditioning that is occurring with that machine. So let's connect that. What is similar, obviously, online gambling is very similar. And but any type of video game is similar to online gambling. And then they started doing some studies and testing, and they found that social media has the same conditioning responses as gambling or game playing. So when you think about it, what would be a payoff in Facebook or Instagram? What's
liking whatever you're seeing.
the likes or the hearts? Yeah. So how many likes? How many hearts did you get? And how many followers did you get? And so I was talking, so my daughter wanted to start a page, and she's 15 now, and she has hobbies like scrapbooking and journaling and things like that. But she wanted to do tutorials and start an Instagram page. So we said okay. And she's like, look, I got like 50 followers, you know. And she was very happy. And then she tells us how many likes she gets for each of her uh journaling tutorials. And then my wife, who had a a yarn business. She would spin yarn and dye yarn and everything like that. And she had it for years. And she just gave it up during COVID, but she had a lot of followers. And so she's kidding with my daughter, look, I've got, 1,000 followers. And and I'm just laughing at them. I'm like, wow, well, look how many followers I have. And it's all because all of my students use my YouTube. So I'm like, look how many watches this video got. And it's like a 10-year-old theories video on Freud. So, but hey, that's 20 classes of watches. So, um, but yeah, so the payoff is very different. But here's the thing. In gambling, you have to keep playing. But in social media, you have to keep posting. You have to keep the audience engaged. And that ties you to that electronic media, whatever it is, Facebook or Instagram or YouTube. Now they do the same things with ads that they do in casinos with online advertising. Now they have very sophisticated things. They can measure how long you stare at an ad, so you don't actually have to click on it. They can tell whether you pause and look at an ad. You don't even have to click on it. And so it's become not only sophisticated but somewhat insidious. Um, so how many of you have noticed that and this is just, me going on a tangent, but I was talking with my wife and I'm like, oh, look, the neighbor got a new roof. How old's our roof? Our roof is like 20 years old. We might have to think about that. And the next day I get like 20 advertisements in all my social media. It's like they're listening to everything we say. And so it's really, really very strange. So I do think, that there's definitely a connection in how gambling in real life, gambling online, social media, and games. So whether it's internet gaming or whether it's even like PlayStation or Xbox, I think all of those are connected in some way, both giving us payoffs or ways to make money or holding our attention. So they all follow a very similar model to, cause our primitive brains uh, to activate those pleasure zones and create chemicals. So when you think about gambling, people think the payoff is money, but it's really not. It's really that dopamine and serotonin produced by the win. So, all right. So that's just a brief glimpse into the gambling. So I don't think that you should pair there's a couple different types of sexual addiction. There's internet sex addiction, and then there's real life sex addiction. And I talked a little bit about this in last week's video. But so when we think about it, internet sex addiction is usually there's usually no human contact. There may be human interaction. You might actually be able to talk with somebody online. I would say, it all starts with, videos, pornography, and then pay per view things, and then finally interacting with a live human being on the internet. And it is interesting because in some of the studies that I've read, people who have fetishes are very drawn to the internet because they can find whatever their fetish is, and nobody's going to judge them for that. Whereas in real life, they might get a partner and reveal their fetish to their partner, and their partner will break up with them or criticize them or laugh at them or share it with the rest of the world, and they're embarrassed by it. So fetishism is huge when we talk about internet sex addiction. And that's because it's so difficult, even if it's not hurting anybody or themselves, it's so difficult because, they're embarrassed, they're stigmatized, whatever it might be. Usually, if I had a couple in counseling and the issue of some type of philia or fetish came up with one of the partners and the other partner was unwilling, and everything else was fine in the marriage but this one thing, because we would go over how's the rest of the relationship, and usually everything was okay, but but this one area of their sex life. And so depending on what it was, you know, it, it was it's very different if somebody feels uncomfortable with it, or if it could hurt somebody either physically or emotionally. So sadism, masochism, you might cross a line there. But if it's something else that's considered harmless, both emotionally or physically, for instance, a shoe fetish, fairly harmless. If it's not hurting anybody, they could reach a compromise and move on with their lives. And then both people would be satisfied to some degree. One person might get a lot of new shoes. So there could be a payoff. So usually that's what I look at when I talk about these things. Is it hurting anybody? What's, other than being kind of like biased or judgmental or not being into that with one person, what's the harm? You know? And so we process that, you know. But if it can cross that line and become harmful, or make somebody else feel uncomfortable emotionally, then we have to kind of deal with it another way. But it's usually people who have been ridiculed in some way, who have lost relationships, who have been made fun of, that pursue these on the internet. Now, it's not only fetishes or different types of philias, and I'm not talking like pedophilia or anything like that. nothing that can hurt another person. But it's usually, um, could be people who are lonely, who really might not be able to find a relationship for whatever reason. And, the reasons are infinite. But, you know, this is kind of their way of satisfying an urge, a need, but, you know, it becomes an easily accessible means of doing that. And of course, the payoff is, sexual orgasm, which triggers all the pleasure zones in our mind and releases the same chemicals, but it also releases a few more, like oxytocin and a few others. So that's the payoff. It's always brain chemicals. And, so when we think about that, sometimes if they are talking with another live person, even though they're paying that person, another payoff might be they're not so lonely. Um, so I'm not condoning any of it, but I'm just kind of giving you the rundown of this. So that leaves us with um, sex addiction that goes beyond just the internet. It can include the internet, but it can also include other live people. So the big mistake is a lot of, you see it in the news, Tiger Woods and other people, but they get a diagnosis of sex addiction. I can't help myself. I have this diagnosis of sex addiction. And really, it's just a rationality for having an affair or multiple affairs. Um, but it's really not what I would consider sex addiction. Um, so when you think about using a drug, if somebody's addicted to a drug, they want to maintain a certain level of brain chemical payoffs throughout the day, or they'll go through some kind of withdrawal. So, depending on the drug, they might be using that drug, I don't know, 3 times to a dozen times a day. So, it's the same thing with sex addiction. I would only diagnose somebody with a sex addiction if they were using sexuality as often and inappropriately as somebody would use a drug. So people actually would need to maintain that brain chemical payoff multiple times a day. And that would lead them to risky encounters, possibly to prostitution or engaging in prostitution, to internet pornography, a whole host of different types of interactions. And they do have chat rooms where people claiming to have sex addiction can go, and then they can meet up and just for that purpose. So I think it's really a lot riskier and more often than people imagine. Um, so we're talking, many times a day, getting into risky situations where, you know, you might get a sexually transmitted disease, where you might become, where it might be physically dangerous, uh, because you really don't know where you're going, who you're meeting, what the situation is. It could simply be a setup for a robbery. Um, so, you know, when we're thinking about sex addiction, it's a lot more serious than the examples we see in the media. It's a lot more serious than like Tiger Woods or something like that. Um, all right, so that is a brief, um, my my brief take on gambling, gaming, social media, and sex addiction. So I was wondering if anybody had any questions or comments or, yeah.
What's the difference between a porn addiction and an internet sex addiction? Because I thought internet sex is basically just still watching it or like watching a screen or something.
So I think that it's really, I think internet sex addiction is the proper term for it, but pornography is just kind of what people say. But when you think about pornography, you have to think about all of the different types. So it's not just watching videos. It might be subscribing, through a paywall, or it might be looking for a fetish, or it might be getting to know one person online that you pay for, live on like a Zoom camera or something like that. So it's much more expanded than just watching videos. So most times when people say a porn addiction, they think of videos, but it's much more detailed than that now.
I didn't know if there was like a distinct difference between the two, or if it was like interchangeable.
Yeah, I mean, I think one's more professional and one's just the common term. Yeah, I might be wrong, but that's my take. What else? This is really fairly common. Uh, I would, of all the couples that I've counseled, um, if there's a problem in the relationship, um, there's usually overuse of internet pornography or something else. And if it's not pornography, then it's meeting people online. And sometimes it moves to extramarital affairs or, beyond the partnership and beyond the relationship. Sometimes it doesn't. Um, but I would say a lot of times one person realizes how serious a problem is in a relationship because of what they found on the internet or a phone or something like that. What else? All right. So let me change the record setting.